All right, so hi Christine, thank you so much for joining us today from the US. We'll jump straight in. So, can you tell us a little bit about what Declaration for American Democracy's vision is and what your mission is?
Of course. So Declaration for American Democracy is a coalition of 250 plus organizations that are working to make the promise of American democracy real for all of us. So we are an anti-oppression coalition that believes in democratic systems, institutions, and that the leaders must reflect, represent, and respect the diverse multicultural nation that we are and always been. So, together, we believe that for our democracy to work for all of us, it must include all of us. So that's why we're supporting sweeping democracy reforms that would make that promise real.
And what kind of role does people power play in achieving that vision for a democracy that is representative of what America actually looks like?
Sure. And it's absolutely essential. So our goal as a coalition is to pass sweeping legislation to protect our freedom to vote, to get the influence of big and corporate and secret money out of politics, and to make sure that we have an ethical and responsive government. To do that, to pass legislation, and we need to make our voices heard and ensure that every member of Congress, every senator possible is championing our issues and is willing to vote in support of our legislation and advocate for it. And that goes for the president as well. So the people really drive change here. We work a lot to walk folks through the process of making their voices heard through rallies, through meeting with their members of Congress, through organizing in their communities. And we definitely believe that for change to happen in Congress, it really needs to come from the bottom up, from everyday people standing up for what they believe in and calling on their representatives to get it done.
You talked a little bit about how DFAT has a people-powered model. You really believe in change coming from the bottom up, everyday people getting involved and speaking up for what they believe in. Here at Our Democracy, we also run a campaign on getting dirty money, getting corporate influence out of our political system. And we also have a people-powered approach. But we're just getting started in bringing our community together. We're about 2 years old, and I know that DFAT has been around for a bit longer. And you touched on it before about your people power model, but could you tell us in a little bit more detail what kind of people power model that DFAD uses, and how do you build groups, and how do you recruit and engage people in your movement?
Sure. Big question. So I would say there's a lot of different strategies we do to build a people-powered movement. One thing that I think has been really important and successful is our intersectional work and coalition building. So one thing that I think makes our coalition really strong is we have broad representation. So we have organizations from the environmental community, labor unions, organizations that work on racial justice, all coming into the fold and engaging their members on the issues related to our democracy, because we know that whether it's through money in politics or through voting, our democracy really touches all the issues that all of us care about, whether it's healthcare, et cetera. So we do a lot of education work with people across the country broadly, making sure that folks are getting the connection between issues they care about and the need for a functioning and responsive democracy, and our partnerships with other organizations that are, founded on that common ground really help us kind of expand our reach in that way. So I think that's one. Another is by getting in touch with activists and organizations and communities across the country and working in partnership with them, often following their lead. So in the United States, there's tons of organizations and communities across the country that work to protect their freedom to vote and push back against attacks on our democracy. So we reach out to them and we build relationships with them and find ways that national organizations can support their work. And I think that partnership that's based on that respect and following a lead from organizations on the ground, while also providing resources and also for activists that might not be affiliated with a group, training for folks to get involved is really important. So we produce a lot of toolkits to walk folks through, here's the top lines about the bills we're supporting. Here's a training for how you can reach out to your member of Congress. Here's a one-pager on how you can throw a rally and get press coverage. So providing a lot of support through every stage, through education, and then also the taking action stage too.
Yeah. And you talk about having a really strong and really broad base and intersectional coalition. But I imagine that, when you started, it didn't look like that. So how did you build it from, say a core group of people who are working on this issue to expand it to a really broad base and intersectional movement? Like, how did you form those alliances?
Sure. A lot of outreach and relationship building. So as I mentioned, all of the issues that we're working on connects to democracy. So we've had a lot of luck, or a lot of growth for the environmental community, for example, is because we had conversations with folks that work on those issues who absolutely understand that in order for us to combat climate change, we need to get big money out of politics. And in order for us to confront and defeat environmental racism, we need to defeat voter suppression. So these organizations already understood in the environmental community and other communities why a functioning democracy is important. So just reaching out and letting folks know that this is a space where all of us can fight for this one thing, I think was really helpful. So we had to have a lot of kind of one-on-one conversations to bring folks into the fold, and then asking them to organize their own communities. So we have folks in our coalition that are leaders in the climate space who have really reached out to other folks in the climate space and brought them into the fold. So I think that's one, is reaching out to our networks, then asking them to reach out to their networks to grow, and identifying the intersection on where our issues align with theirs, and how fighting for our issues is fighting for their issues. So I think that's one. And then when it comes to just like meeting folks who are doing the work on the ground in places across the country, we went to a lot of those places and used our relationships to ask around, who should we be meeting with? Who might have a story that can outline and underscore the importance of what we're fighting for, or who's at the center of the movement in this community? So I think actually getting to know folks on the ground and meeting with as many people as possible, and then supporting those folks to lead has really helped with that as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you've done a really good job at helping other issues, say whether it be climate change or whether it be anti-racism or queer rights. You've helped them to understand how democracy intersects really strongly with their issue, so that you've been able to build a really broad and strong coalition with that. What kind of like framing or messaging did you use to help, other social issues and causes to understand that democracy is a key part of, what they're fighting for, as well as what you're fighting for?
Sure. We always believed that speaking to folks, to our values, was really, really important. And also not getting too stuck in some of the wonky technical details. We've had a lot of luck really just re-emphasizing the way for us to make progress on the issues Americans care about most, or people care about most, is to have a democracy where all of our voices are heard, where all of our votes are counted and equally represented, where we have fair representation. In the United States, we have a big problem with gerrymandering, but a lot of people don't know what gerrymandering is, believe it or not. So again, that's an example of how we try to, speak to kind of top lines, what we're actually talking about, instead of these kind of wonkier terms that everyday people might not be familiar with. So we talked about, you know, fair representation, making sure that all of our votes and voices are counted. And then, like you said, money in politics as well, is a big intersection with so many issues. So, you know, while also keeping it at top lines, and we're talking to specific audiences, it's not hard to pull examples of different corporations, big oil companies in the case for environmental sphere, but also you could look at really any sphere and outline and do a through line for, you know, if we are going to make progress on this issue, we need to make sure that corporations are not funneling unlimited funds of secret money in our elections. So that's been a way that we found success in just making that connection and really just reinforcing that our votes are powerful. We need to make sure that they are fairly represented through fair districts. And also we need to get, you know, big money out of politics, corporate money out of politics, to make sure that everyone's voices are heard equally and that everyone is prioritized in our policymaking process, not just big wealthy corporations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, I mean, when we talk about democracy, it can seem kind of like an amorphous kind of abstract construct that kind of rolls around every election cycle, but it's so much more than that. And it affects all the issues that we care about. Because when we do have big corporations that have an influence over our politics, it means that our voices, every individual voices aren't being heard, right?
Absolutely.
It sounds like you work with a really diverse group of change makers and individuals across the country, but you're not always going to have the same views on all the issues. You're going to have diversity, you're going to have disagreement. Do you have, like, how do you overcome that? Like, how do you get people to work together who might have different beliefs?
Sure. That's a really great question. So I think how we've approached it so far is, first off, know what you absolutely need to agree on as a coalition. So for us, that's our values. So, you know, I mentioned at the beginning that we are like an anti-oppression coalition. So folks have to agree to our values of inclusivity and diversity and respecting that. And two, for us, we have a goal, and that's to pass sweeping federal democracy reform. For us, that looks like the Freedom to Vote Act, which was our bill that we pushed all of last year and are still advocating for. And that bill is a sweeping bill that includes all of these policies that we're really excited about that are critical to building the democracy that we want. So that's our non-negotiable. To work with us in partnership and to be in our coalition, folks need to at least agree on the policies that we're fighting for. And aside from that, we try to get consensus. And consensus doesn't always mean that you're excited about every detail, but that folks can generally live with it. So for that, we have coalition spaces. We have a number of working groups where we hash things out, where we talk about strategy and tactics. And there's certainly disagreement sometimes on tactics or strategy. So first off, we create a space where there can be kind of those robust conversations. And then we do a temperature check and we see where folks are at and roll by consensus. And that model has got us pretty far at this point. We haven't run into any big issues. I think folks understand that as a big coalition of 250 groups, we can't agree to everything all the time, but so long as we're transparent, that we offer space for folks to vocalize disagreements or alternative ways of doing things or ideas, that folks can live with the outcome. So I think that's been really helpful. And if there's ever a big decision and we just want to pull the entire group, that's what we'll do. We'll send a survey to the entire group of organizations and figure out where we're going to land. And, you know, like I said, we do need to agree on the big thing of passing this bill, but we don't always need to agree on everything. So for us, in the United States, we have a thing called the filibuster, which is a big obstacle in our Senate. Some groups last year wanted to abolish it. Some groups wanted to change it. and we had to figure out where the coalition was going to land. And where we landed was that we needed to address the filibuster, but different organizations vocalized their different vision for how they would want to address it, and that's fine. As I think that in a coalition sometimes we're a choir and we don't need to agree on everything, but we need to know what we need to agree on, and when there's more room for organizations to have their own approach. And sometimes that's actually a strength, is for different organizations to highlight, different messages.
Yeah, so it sounds like really coming together on those shared values and that shared mission is crucial, getting agreement on that, and then also baking in those principles of democracy, of consensus and participation is crucial to, bringing together a diverse group. What have you learned, or what kind of mistakes have you learned from when it comes to movement building?
Sure. I think one thing is making sure that whatever we're doing to organize folks, that first off, folks are bought in on the vision and the plan, but also the tactics as well, is really, really important. So if our goal is to have 200 rallies across the country, super important that we have organizations that are excited to make that happen. So one thing that I think we've learned is how important it is to make sure that through that process of planning days of action or events, that you are getting the buy-in you need to set up for success. Another thing that I've learned is to identify if something isn't working and be okay, changing course sometimes. And then lastly, when planning events for activists, keep it simple. Folks are busy. And I think we want to be really creative with our actions, which can inject more energy into the movement. But we also want to respect that a lot of our activists may have jobs, may have kids, may have responsibilities. So they might not be able to, drop everything and do a big, trip or a big walk, but they probably can plan a rally, or maybe they can do a visit with a member of Congress. So I think making sure that there's different levels of engagement and that we're meeting people where they're at, and sometimes that we're not overcomplicating things and we're doing the things that we know will work, and that are accessible to folks.
Yeah, I think keeping it simple is such a good point. And I think it leads me to my next question. Is that how do you keep people engaged? The US has been going through a pretty tumultuous time in terms of democracy, and I do imagine that on one hand it can be a motivator for people to join your movement, but on the other hand it could lead to like a sense of despair or helplessness. And yeah, like you said, people are busy, people have got children, they've got jobs. So how do you create that sense of hope, and how do you keep people motivated in this work?
That's a really good question as well. So I think one thing that's important is making sure that folks are clear on our path to winning, to securing the sweeping democracy reform that all of us need and that our country needs. And making sure that folks are bought in on the way to get there, and that you're just being clear with activists on what that path might look like. So I'm a firm believer in not, sugarcoating or over-promising, making sure that if it's going to be a longer fight, that folks are prepped for that, so that you have that basic level of trust and you can move folks along. So I think that that's a core part of the relationship building, so that you're really kind of in the fight together and that folks are feeling like you're in partnership. So with that, there are a lot of opportunities where we can move things forward in the short term, even if you can't win the sweeping reform you want right now. I think understanding the steps to getting there is critical. So at least for us, we are stalled at the moment for passing our federal democracy reform package. We have elections coming up in November that will help determine whether we can pass federal reform or not. But for the time being, there's a lot of things that folks can be working on the state level that can help us in the short term strengthen the freedom to vote and democracy in their states and in their communities, but also build towards that longer goal of winning. So I think that figuring out sometimes in a more individualized approach, how that can look like in different states and different communities, where they can move things along. Maybe that's through passing a local bill or resolution to protect election workers, or maybe that's working on a statewide ballot measure campaign or a statewide bill that then aligns to winning something federally, nationwide, and sweeping. So I think being nimble, finding ways that you can secure progress, even when you're building towards that longer goal. So for us, we're looking at executive actions that might not be the sweeping thing we need, but can be a positive step forward that can keep us building momentum. So I think that's one big thing. It's just finding out where you can make progress and helping get folks plugged into doing that. And then also just continuing to make the connection whenever things are happening in the news to how it connects back to democracy, and using those key moments. So I mentioned before we hopped on the call that in the United States right now, Congress is having hearings around January 6th. So we're working to make sure that Americans understand that January 6th is not just about that one day for the United States, it's about broader attacks on our democracy. And that just to ensure we have a functioning democracy, we need to pass these policies that end voter suppression, that get big money out of politics, et cetera. So I think that there's also this narrative work that we need to do. In the US, we really need to make sure that Americans are hearing from us, because we know that there are forces who are spreading the big lie and false claims about our election. So we need to make sure that we are winning the narrative, that we're reaching more and more folks, and reinforcing our message that we need to work towards a true democracy, and these policies are how we can get there. And in the meantime, our elections are secure.
Yeah. Yeah, you're so right about celebrating the wins along the way to help build that momentum. I know that our community will be disappointed that you aren't able to join us live. How can I find out more about your campaign and support you from here?
Sure. Yes. Well, I'm excited to watch the event later. Thank you for offering to send me a recording so I can see everyone. I'm sorry you can't join in person, but really appreciate the invite to join. For folks who want to follow our journey, our Facebook is DFAD, DFAD coalition.org. And you can also follow us on Twitter at DFAD Coalition.
Brilliant. I just had one more question about, you talked about the legislative reforms that you're ultimately working towards. Can you tell us about where they are, how they're tracking, and how close how close you are to achieving those legislative reforms?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a bill. It's called, the first name was For the People Act, and then it changed and was the Freedom to Vote Act. But essentially, when our coalition formed, we created our kind of dream list of what would be involved in an ideal democracy. And then that essentially became the bill that we're all advocating for the People / Freedom to Vote Act. And we made a lot of gains in the past 4 years. A lot of the policies in our bill were not necessarily at the top of the priority list for either of our major parties here. But after a lot of work, we are at a point where our bill had the support of every single House Democrat and every single Senate Democrat. And that Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer declared that democracy was a top priority. So our bill was called, HR1 or S1, which indicates that it's a top priority for the caucus. So we were at a point where the majority of members of Congress and senators supported our legislation, and where the president was advocating for our legislation. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, we hit this hurdle called the filibuster, where we essentially need a supermajority to pass legislation in the Senate. And because a couple senators weren't willing to change the filibuster, our bill is currently stalled. that being said, although our bill is stalled for now, it's absolutely amazing how far we've come as a movement, where we went from this being something that maybe like a few senators talked about to now it being the mainstream, to it being something that when folks run for president in the United States, they're talking about as a major priority for them. And we're at a place where when you look at polling of the American people, folks are saying that money in politics is a top concern. Folks are saying that democracy is the top issue for them. So we're also seeing this change happen amongst the American people, in addition to it becoming a major priority for one of our major parties here.
Yeah, I can definitely see a lot of similarities. It's the reforms that we are similarly fighting for are not exactly a top priority for both of the major parties here. And how, like, what specific actions or tactics did people in your movement use to make these reforms a priority for the senators?
Sure. So we did kind of an array of tactics, of kind of our tried and true tactics. So one, of course, is meeting with members of Congress. So we have an election, then every time we're moving into a new Congress, we provide resources for activists to meet with their members and to urge them to support our legislation as an urgent priority. So we have a really big emphasis right after the election to meet with all of our members of Congress immediately and to train folks up to talk about these issues. If you have any good polling that shows how popular it is, that can always be persuasive to members of Congress. And also, getting people to share personal stories around why this matters. So that's the first thing is we always try to start off a new Congress strong by meeting with as many members as possible and asking them to support the legislation and then tracking them on that commitment. So that's one thing. Another thing that we've done is we've really cultivated our champions of democracy in the House and Senate. So inviting folks to speak on our activist calls, working with them to, maybe publish op-eds. So supporting their leadership on this has been helpful because it shows them when they hop on a call and they see X amount of people on it, it energizes them and encourages them to really lean in and talk about it and shows them how much people care about the issue. And then another thing is holding events nationwide. So that helps both with the media and also helps with building community and communities across the country. I think folks coming together can be really powerful in building community, but also, like I said, inviting the press, getting press there, and then at least here, members of Congress, they read their local paper. They have, a Google notification where if their name is mentioned in the press, their comms person sees it and usually sends it to them. So during the Freedom to Vote Act push, we really held a lot of events that generated positive press coverage. So that members were hearing about this everywhere. They were hearing about it at their local office. They were seeing it on TV. They were hearing about it in the paper. They were getting calls to their offices as we ran a pretty good call campaign. We ran an LTE campaign. So really trying to make our voices heard in all of these different spaces. And then I think also being ready for rapid response moments has been helpful too. So if something big happens that connects to democracy, responding to that, getting media on it. If we can get a major publication, kind of even better. If you can kind of raise it to be like the national conversation for a day, that could be helpful too. So yeah, just a few strategies that we've done in the past.
Yeah, it sounds like they're all strategies that anyone at different level of engagement and with different commitment levels can take part and engage with. And my final question for you, Christine, is what is a last piece of advice for someone who's wanting to work in the democracy space and wanting to build a fair democracy? What would you say to them?
That's a really great question. I think how I would emphasize how important it is to be in community with other folks. That's something that has always been rewarding to me and has helped me recharge and has helped me stay hopeful, is I think a lot about civil rights activists in the 60s in the United States and how they've had to deal with kind of so much more than I have had to deal with in terms of the fight, and how people have been fighting for hundreds of years for our democracy. And there was many setbacks before we passed in the United States the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. So it's not always going to be like the winning moment. There's going to be setbacks, but that's why being in community with folks is so important, because they're what recharges all of us, and having that support system, I think, is really important, and inspiring each other and ourselves to keep fighting, because the win will happen, even if it's a longer arc than you think, and you can meet some really amazing people on the way, that are just as passionate as you, and that can form really amazing friendships too.
Yeah, you're so right about having a community around you. I mean, like, so many people come for the cause, but they stay for the people that they meet and the communities that they're part of, right?
Sure. And it's okay if it's an online community. If you're in a rural area, that's fine. And you don't have a ton of folks around. First off, I met a lot of great folks that had rallies with 7 people that got awesome press coverage, and that was really amazing for them. So that's awesome. But also, if you don't have anyone around, join the online community. That's fine too. I've met a lot of good friends online.
Amazing.